To our viewers watching on PBS in the United States and to all of you around the world, welcome. We begin the day with the crude and crafts in these final days of campaigning for the White House. We reported on the garbage gaffe at the start of the program, but there is much more. On Sunday at a Trump rally in New York City, one of the speakers said Vice President Kamala Harris has pimp handlers. Well, some voters say it fits a pattern of misogynistic comments that Donald Trump is known for. The latest installment came yesterday. At a Trump rally, the former president described a conversation that he claims he had with his staff about women. Take a listen.
And my people told me about 4 weeks ago, I was saying, no, I want to protect the people. I want to protect the women of our country. I want to protect the women. Sir, please don't say that. Why? They said, we think it's very inappropriate for you to say. I said, why? I'm president. I want to protect the women of our country. They said, sir, I just think it's inappropriate for you to say, pay these guys a lot of money. Can you believe it? I said, well, I'm going to do it whether the women like it or not. I'm going to protect them. I'm going to protect them from migrants coming in. I'm going to protect them from foreign countries that want to hit us with missiles and lots of other things.
All right, I'm joined now by Julian Müller-Kahler with the German Council on Foreign Relations. He focuses on the U.S. and transatlantic relations. He's the man to talk to right now. Julian, it's good to have you on the program. Donald Trump, he has never polled well with women voters. I mean, his campaign advisors, they are apparently aware of that. Trump doesn't seem to care too much about it. Can he continue to alienate female voters and still win this election next Tuesday?
Oh, good to be with you again. I think the important numbers are obviously the gender gap tilt, the difference between the female lead and the male lead. So the important question really is whether that gap or that alienation of female voters is as destructive to his campaign and success than the attraction that he has with male voters. It's actually interesting, the numbers that we see currently indicate that it's pretty close to the numbers that we saw 2016. So he has about a 10-point lead with males and a 10-point disadvantage with women. So they sort of equalize each other out, but it's certainly a question that we'll see the result on Tuesday.
Talking about voters, according to the University of Florida's election lab, more than 60 million people have already voted in early voting. I mean, that smashes the early voter turnout record that we saw set back in 2020. What do you read into this?
I think historically, Democrats used to be the ones that went to the polls early. The numbers that we're seeing at the moment indicate that that's not the case this time around. Early voting numbers are up on both sides of the political spectrum. And the traditional rule that high voter turnout usually favors the Democrats, I think with Trump on the ballot is not necessarily the case. You see that he brought a lot of folks into the political debate again that have previously not voted. So it's going to be, it's very hard to make predictions on how voter turnout, including early voting, is affecting the results in this presidential election.
I want to ask you too about absentee ballots. I spoke with my local election commission in North Carolina this week. I was told that they've had to increase security at polling places and at election offices. They told me that verbal and physical threats have been made. I mean, do you expect violence after Election Day, regardless of the result?
So I think we don't see another January 6th like we saw in the aftermath of the last presidential election for a variety of reasons. I think that, first of all, the Biden administration is in power. So you see the National Guard being under the control of the Biden administration, and cautions have been taking place in Washington, D.C. itself. However, it's not unlikely that you see something similar on the regional level. It depends a lot on how close the election is going to be and how long we will have to wait until we see a final result. And I could see that particularly in some places where they only start counting votes from mail-in ballots after the polls have closed, that you see a lot of confusion around how those numbers might change. And if they are particularly close, I mean, we see that in the 2000 election, it took a couple of weeks in Florida to potentially recount and then a Supreme Court decisions. So if we are in a scenario like this, I think the potential for violence and civil unrest is higher, irrespective of who wins the election.
Do you think that we could see something like a repeat of 2000 where, this could be taken all the way to the Supreme Court to decide?
Well, those states that really matter this time around are obviously the Rust Belt states, previously known as the Blue Wall. So it's Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So I think those are on the East Coast. So, you see early trends on that. If Pennsylvania or Michigan are so close that they are in that margin where you can request a recount, irrespective of who actually wins, I could see a scenario in which the final election result is being dragged out. It all really matters on how decisive Trump or Harris win is going to be at the end of the day. And that will then matter what the consequences and implications of a potential recount or confusions around the numbers will look like.
This is the third U.S. presidential election with Donald Trump as a candidate. Regardless of the outcome on Tuesday, what have the past 8 years done to transatlantic ties?
Well, I would argue that Trump is more of a symptom than he is a cause of significant change within the American electorate. I think already Obama had the argument to say, well, what are all our foreign engagements worth if, we could have spent all that money on bridges and roads here in the United States. So I think after the war on terror, this expansion of military engagement around the world, you sort of see a new economic and foreign policy nationalism that Trump obviously is a very powerful symptom, but also that the Biden administration has exemplified, so to the frustration of the Europeans. I think Trump, yes, is loud in its criticism of European partners, in its criticism of NATO and obligations, but actually, particularly on the economic front and the foreign policy front, you see quite a bit of alignment between the Harris campaign and Trump, much to the detriment of European allies.
Julian Müller-Keller from the German Council on Foreign Relations. Julian, we appreciate your time and your analysis tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Well, much of the polarization in U.S. politics today really began almost a decade ago in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Covert Russian influence deeply affected that election, undermining many voters' confidence that their votes, their elections were safe from foreign meddling. In the years since, U.S. authorities claim they have learned lessons and are better equipped to deal with the threat. But they also warn that Russia has not backed off, and other countries are also trying their hand at bending the will of U.S. voters.
When right-wing commentator Tim Pool announced just over a week ago to his 2 million followers that he was stepping back from his successful YouTube show, he said it was for personal reasons.
So with that being said, it's kind of the weirdest way to announce that I'm pursuing, my family life to the best of my abilities.
But many speculated that the real reason had something to do with the recent Department of Justice investigation, claiming that he was being paid by Russia to spread pro-Trump disinformation. The indictment alleges that Russia funneled $10 million to 3 political commentators, one of them assumed to be Pool, laundered through a US-based shell company without disclosing to them that the funding was foreign. Authorities say it's part of Moscow's effort to influence the 2024 election, which they say has become more sophisticated since its first major efforts in 2016, although efforts to counter interference have also improved.
In 2024, in my opinion, we have a good reason to be a bit more optimistic, so to speak, that the threat has been smaller than in 2016. And the key reason is because that basically better performance on the side of American intelligence agencies, as well as better responsibility from relevant media organs.
Still, it proves to be a game of cat and mouse. While the Department of Justice managed to shut down the phony company funneling Moscow's money to Tim Pool, Russia continues to generate a flood of posts from fake accounts on social media platforms such as X, Instagram, and TikTok aimed at U.S. voters. The U.S. intelligence community also says 2 other foreign powers are targeting U.S.'s upcoming election, Iran and China. Iran appears to be focusing its efforts at preventing Trump from taking office, targeting particular groups through fake websites such as Afro Majority aimed at black voters and Not Our War aimed at veterans. China, according to U.S. intelligence, does not appear to have a preference in the presidential election, but is focusing efforts on unseating down-ballot politicians with anti-China views. Investigators exposed a Chinese-linked online campaign against Marsha Blackburn, a Republican congresswoman whose aggressive anti-China stance has garnered national attention.
We're going to have to break a lot more China to save America.
Beijing has insisted that it does not intend to and will not interfere in the U.S. election. While U.S. national security officials have prepared for the threat of foreign meddling, they haven't ruled out new methods that may only come to light after the votes are cast.
Well, to dig a little deeper into this, I'm joined by Mona Charen. She's the host of the popular podcast Beg to Differ. Mona, it's good to have you with us. I dare say that most Americans have heard about Russia's past efforts to interfere in U.S. elections, but the threat from China has not been on the radar of a lot of voters. Is China interested in swaying and the outcomes of U.S. elections the same way that Russia has been and still is?
So you're absolutely right that this has gotten comparatively little attention this year. I guess Americans are so focused on our own internal divisions that we've taken external influences and those who are seeking to interfere. But yes, China is interfering in the election or attempting to, as Russia is. But it's unclear how effective that will be. Even in 2016, the year that Russia's efforts were the most flamboyant, it's hard to say that it had a measurable impact on actual voters. Very hard to measure.
Everyone is expecting the election this time around to be very close. And if that is the case, I mean, if the poll numbers are reliable, theoretically, then it wouldn't take much to sway a relatively small number of voters and then sway the entire outcome of the vote, would it?
It's a fair point. And look, I mean, if you look at the broad sweep of civilizations, whenever one country has been successful in intervening in the affairs of another, it's almost always because of internal divisions in the first country. So when Pizarro landed in South America, you know, the Incas were already at war with one another, and that's why he was so able to conquer. It's a very old story, and it's something that we Americans don't pay enough attention to. We tend to be so insular. We're surrounded by oceans, and we think we're invulnerable. But of course, our internal divisions are a source of weakness and something that other nations will seek to exploit. And of course, you're right. With the election being so close, any small variation in the number of votes one way or the other could be decisive.
You know, the polarization of politics in Washington means that the U.S. Senate, for example, takes too much time to approve ambassador appointments. With that in mind, I want you to take a listen to what U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken told members of Congress about what is or perhaps is not happening. Take a listen.
The system is broken. It's damaging our diplomacy. It's undermining our competitiveness. It's disincentivizing public service. And of course, this all feeds our competitors' false narratives of our decline and division.
He was speaking to the Foreign Service there, not Congress, but the issue remains trust and a lack thereof in the system. That's what he's talking about. What does a foreign country such as China, what do they get from that lack of trust in the system?
Yes, the goal of autocracies is to convince people in their own societies that democracies don't work better than autocracies, that the democracies of the world are fatally flawed, cannot get anything done, are riven by disputes internally, don't really have significant freedoms that are in excess of what people get in autocracies. And so that is their goal, to discredit the democratic world. And unfortunately, when we are tied up in knots fighting one another, it does play into that narrative for them that we are dysfunctional. Of course, it isn't true, even with all of our problems. People around the world still struggle to come to the free and democratic world and try to leave countries like China and Russia.
But you know, perception does matter. And I think, particularly inside the United States, there is this perception that we've dropped the ball when it comes to projecting this power. How confident are you that U.S. authorities are doing a good enough job when it comes to uncovering and preventing foreign interference, and of course, most importantly, that they are preventing foreign meddling in elections?
Well, I'm afraid that very much depends upon who is elected on Tuesday, or however long it takes to determine the outcome. Unfortunately, Donald Trump has welcomed foreign interference in our elections as long as it benefited him. And so that, you know, I would not expect that to change. There are Trump supporters who have who've worn T-shirts saying that they would prefer Putin to Biden. That was the last time around. Yeah, that it very much depends. I would say if Kamala Harris is elected, I think you will see a lot more of the kind of traditional concern about foreign interference, and if Trump is elected, then less.
Mona, I've got 15 seconds. Do you dare to make a prediction of who's going to win on Tuesday?
Oh, why not? I'll go out on a limb and say that I do think Harris will win by a hair, just because of the strength of the female vote this time around.
Finally, someone willing to take a stand. Yeah, we'll take that one. Mona, chair and host of the podcast Beg to Differ. Mona, we appreciate you being on the show, and we'll be in touch. Maybe we can talk next week after Election Day. We'll see what happens. Thank you. Is Donald Trump a fascist? His former chief of staff says so, and he says that Trump was envious of the power that Adolf Hitler had. Now, this was reason enough for DW's Washington Bureau Chief Enos Pohl to speak with historian Timothy Ryback, the author of Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power.
Timothy Ryback, thank you so much for taking time to speak with DW.
Happy to be here.
There's a huge debate here in the United States whether it is correct to call Donald Trump or compare Donald Trump with Adolf Hitler. What do you say to that?
I think there are fascistic postures, but I don't know if I would go as far to identify someone specifically as a fascist. The single most, to my mind, similar identifier is an absolute blindness to any kind of defeat, anything that doesn't fit into your worldview. Adolf Hitler was astonishing. He went from one catastrophe to another, from one defeat to another. He ran in the presidential election of 1932. He lost by 6 million votes. And you know what he did? He claimed election fraud, and he went to court to have the election results overturned.
What else do you see in him with a fascist tendency?
Trump did say he would be dictator for one day on day one. And he identifies that as a modality for governance and rule, which we've known for millennia. They're, the authoritarian rulers. And, Hitler definitely embraced that, and I think Trump's embrace of that authoritarian rule, the vengeance, all of that is the most unsettling part of it. But I think this inherent view that democratic processes are not the best way to run a country is certainly, unquestionably, a key fascistic trait. Hitler himself declared that he vowed to destroy democracy through democratic process. He had to appear in court as a witness at a trial in September 1930, and Hitler basically said this to the judge, that he was out to destroy democracy through democratic process. The judge said so, but through constitutional processes. Hitler gave a one-word answer, jawohl.
This is one of the biggest fears with the Trump administration, that he really will undermine the democratic structure here in the United States.
I personally am concerned. We do have guardrails. I've studied, as have many scholars, the guardrails that existed for the Weimar Republic, but it's how these constitutional protections can be protected, how resilient they can be against a determined autocrat. What I will remind you is that Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933. Joseph Goebbels said, once we're in office, he said, they're going to have to drag us out as corpses. And in April of 1945, that's exactly what happened. It was the only way they ended that government. So I think for the U.S. Constitution, for all the protections that are there, it's only as strong, it's only as resilient as the people who are there to protect it.
The Weimar Republic wasn't that old compared to the United States. Is the United States better equipped to fight attacks and to be overturned as the Weimar Republic has been?
Peter Gay, who once said, the Weimar Republic died twice. It was murdered and it committed suicide. We all know who committed the murder, that was clear. But the state suicide by a constitutional democracy is a much more complicated process. And there, it really comes down to the electorate, to the voters. And if there's anything, look, we live in a country protected by First Amendment rights, freedom of speech. Donald Trump has the right to say within limits anything that he wishes, as appalling as it might be to me. What I don't understand is that 50% of the Americans, or close to 50%, possibly 51%, we'll see, are willing to embrace this. This is going back to the Hitler-Trump comparison. They laid out their agenda for everyone to see. Adolf Hitler was one of the few politicians who kept his campaign promises to a horrific degree. Let's hope that Mr. Trump doesn't keep all of his campaign promises, and we don't see the guillotine being rolled out if he wins.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much.
Have a good time.
Good talking.
It's October 31st. It's Halloween. That means time